So it's my honor once again, to introduce our panel. I don't know how KC managed to put this group together. Once again, this is just spectacular. We'll go ahead and start to my left with none other than Dr. Walter Bradley. And you've got the bios in front of you, so I'm not going to read all the details. We're going to save some more time for Q&A, which is what I think you're here for tonight. So I'll go through these kind of quickly. Dr. Bradley is professor and chairman emeritus of the University of Miami Department of Neurology. We have Dr. Larry Brand back with us again. Larry's with the University of Miami Rosenstein School of Marine and Atmospheric Sciences, University of Miami. We have none other than Dr. Paul Allen Cox, who came to us all the way from Wyoming. Dr. Cox is an ethnobotanist and executive director of the Brain Chemistry Labs, a nonprofit research organization. Thank you so much for being here. Dr. David A. Davis, who's just a hero in the science field with so many of these folks. He's assistant research professor of neurology at the University of Miami, Miller School of Medicine. We have Holly Round. Work a lot with Holly. Holly's a ranger. She's a retired certified midwife and public health nurse. Thank you, Holly, for being here once again. Dr. Howard Simon, one of the newest members of our board, has quite a reputation here in Florida. Retired last year as the longest serving state director of the American Civil Liberties Union. Thank you, Dr. Simon. We have Dr. Parizama Taib, who's a board certified internal medicine physician. Dr. Taib has a tremendous community ethic and is a great at civic engagement on top of being a physician. I'm really, really proud that she's here with us again. And none other than Dr. Robert Sarantz, who I've worked with on some advocacy issues, and he's an otolaryngologist. Oh, almost got it that time. Really a great guy. His family's helped us. His daughters were at the litigation we were involved in. And I just wanted to mention too that, part of what we do at Colusa Waterkeeper is policy reform, advocacy. And you may know that back in December, we asked the Army Corps of Engineers to accelerate the revision of the lake regulation schedule. We filed a notice of intent to sue in federal court in that context. We did our best to come to a conclusion with the federal agencies. We had lots of conference calls. But we were left with no other choice to file in federal district court on June 11th regarding the lake regulation schedule. May 23rd, we asked the Florida Department of Environmental Protection. This is along, once again, with the Center for Biological Diversity, the Sanibel Captiva Conservation Foundation. We asked FDEP to adopt the 2 cyanotoxins as regulated contaminants in the state of Florida, enforceable under the Clean Water Act. Okay, so that outcome is, both approaches are still pending. And we just really appreciate your support and being with us, trying to improve and reform policy here in the state of Florida. If the state were to adopt both of those environmental toxins, those 2 cyanotoxins, it would be the first time in the United States that a state has adopted these 2 cyanotoxins as being regulated standards in the state, enforceable by the Clean Water Act. You'd think, we should be there already, but we're not. There's no other state that's done that yet, which is really an amazing statement in and of itself. So without further ado, we will start.
So I'm Walter Bradley, and I deal with ALS and other chronic neurological diseases that may well be related to cyanobacteria. There are other causes as well, but cyanobacteria, one of those causes that we may well be able to do something about, as well as being able to do something about cyanobacterial blooms.
Larry Brand, I'm an algal ecologist. The first half of my career, I just sort of studied the basic biology, ecology, and evolution of algae. At low concentrations of nutrients in algae, and they're the base of the food chain. If you didn't have algae in the ocean, you wouldn't have a food chain or seafood. Unfortunately, at really high concentrations of nutrients, you get these large harmful algal blooms, which we know have a lot of toxins that are harmful to people because of these toxins. So basically, the second half of my career, I'm basically focusing on these harmful algal blooms. my research focuses primarily on the causes. In other words, what's the sources of these nutrients that are feeding these algal blooms. You've heard a lot tonight about microcystin and BMA. I just want to point out there are a lot of other toxins that we know are produced by cyanobacteria. And on top of that, there's good reason to believe there's a lot of other toxins produced by these cyanobacteria that we haven't even discovered yet. So I guess for me, that's sort of the bottom line. Don't wait for someone to actually go out and measure the toxin and say whether it's there or not. You should just assume there's probably toxins in those blooms. So, you know, if you see those blooms, I certainly would not swim in that water. I certainly would not eat the fish or other seafood in that water.
My name's Paul Cox. I'm an ethnobotanist. I live in Jackson Hole, Wyoming. I was hoping that our real expert on cyanobacteria, Dr. James Metcalf, could be here, but he got tied up in some protein sequencing, so I wanted to come down and support you. Thank you. Let me just say that as Americans, I believe, and Howard, you correct me on this, but I think these people have a right to have clean water. Would you agree with that? I think you're right. And I want to say perhaps it's your responsibility. I've been reading a book by Robert Coles, the Harvard sociologist, called The Call of Service. Coles says that when your passions and interests intersect a deep societal need, you're hearing a call. And I'd like to suggest that the fact that you're here tonight, each of you, means that you have a role to play. If you can fix this problem here, and you have the right scientists here, you have the right universities, you have the right clinicians, you have the right activists, you have the right legal standing. If you can fix this problem here and fix it forever, that solution will go throughout the world. So can I just suggest that I believe you have a call in your own way to get clean water here. It is your right, but it is also your responsibility. We stand ready in Wyoming to help you any way we can.
Hello, my name is David. I'm very excited to be here and a little feedback.
Closer. It's working, just closer.
Okay, sorry. Very excited to be here and to see the support for the mission of clean water. And my goal as a scientist is to look at how toxins affect the brain and across the lifespan. So I constantly ask questions of if someone's exposed to a certain type of toxin, what will happen in a week or 2 weeks or a month or a couple of years, and those are the kind of questions I asked in the laboratory. And to be in front of so many people who care about this subject is really, really a remarkable thing, and I've never seen anything like this. So I like to thank the audience for coming out tonight and supporting what we're doing here. So I think it's ultimately going to be you all that's going to push the make the changes that we're trying to bring across, and by bringing data and things like that. So thank you all.
Thank you. Well, my name is Holly Rowan, and in addition to being a Colusa Waterkeeper Ranger and a retired public health nurse, I'm also the co-founder of the Pachamama Alliance of Southwest Florida. What we do is we have a formula that is global, with many, many contributors, to raise people up to be better, enlightened communicators and game changers. And what I see here, it just opened my heart so much to hear what Dr. Cox just said, that each one of us really is here because I think that we do have a calling. And the calling is the same one that I've committed myself to and recommitted myself to over and over again, and that is the right to clean water. Water is life. Water is life. Mini Wachoni. And so one of the things, I'm so happy that I decided to keep my nursing license active. And over the last year, as I became a Colusa Waterkeeper Ranger. And I did so because I made a drawdown from global warming commitment to one solution of 100 solutions that I learned about from Paul Hawken, who's a very well-known economist and author. And that one solution that I chose to dedicate the rest of my life to is protecting our coastal wetlands. And so that brings me here. As I was looking for continuing education programs to do my required 30 hours as a nurse, I looked all over the country for a course that would teach me about cyanobacteria and airborne algal blooms, and I found nothing. Nothing for nurses, nothing for doctors, nothing for any mid-level practitioners. And so when we got the grant, and I want to again thank the Southwest Florida Community Foundation and 3 of their funds that helped us put all of this programming together. When I found out about it, I came to one of our board meetings, Colusa Waterkeeper, and I made the suggestion that we translate all of this research from these illustrious scientists and physicians and advocates, that we need to translate it into continuing education programming right here, starting in Lee Health. And so we're going to do that. We're going to do that. And then we're going to also teach it to registered nurses, because nurses are on the front line. So, and we do discharge planning. We are the last, and we do intake. We do triage. And so the nurses and the doctors here really need that education. And Dr. Zarans, who you'll hear from, myself, and there's a couple of nurses here in the room that said they really want to help us with this. We're going to start with Lee Health, but we're going to take it on the road. As much as we know and what we don't know. So just one last thing. Those codes are really important, especially if you are a healthcare provider. But if you just walk in as a patient and say, I want you to use this code, you're probably going to get your physician to shut down. So we need to learn how to be better patients too, and historians. And maybe I can help with that in the future. So thank you all for being here. It's an honor.
So my name is Howard Simon. I am decidedly not the scientist here. My PhD degree is in philosophy and social ethics at the American Civil Liberties Union, in which my job was to try to affect change through changes in public policies. And I am privileged to be able to learn and work with the other eminent scientists that are on this panel, to be able to translate their science into public policy reforms. And that means, and I apologize for using the dirty word here, but that means politics. That's really what this is about, because there is no solution unless there is going to be statewide laws and standards that are imposed on this. So I think I'm so fortunate to be a member of the board of Colusa Waterkeeper. They have not only done a wonderful job of explaining and putting forth before the public the science, but I hope that one of the purposes of this evening that we accomplish is also information about how we can all work together to prevent the crisis further that we are all involved in. And I hope we get to talk further about strategies for public policy changes. I got lots of things to say about that, but I do want to say a couple of things in closing. We are not going to be serious about this until we address the problem at its source, not dealing with the effects, but at its source. Number 2, the state is not going to get serious until it changes the political culture. And the political culture now is dependent on voluntary best management practices. Voluntary best management practices, which are not working, and that has to be replaced by enforceable statewide standards. And the last thing that I want to say is I want to convey to you the bad news that this has got to change, because the legislature does not work for you, and it does not work for the interest of the people, and it does not work on the problem of public health. 2 years ago, we had the biggest outbreak of red tide on the West Coast in people's memory, perhaps in Florida's history. On the East Coast, we had the biggest outbreak of blue-green algae in people's memory, or perhaps in Florida's history. All of the politicians vowed to do something, and at the end of the legislative session that ended earlier this year, what was done on these issues was nothing. Absolutely nothing. That has got to change. That has got to change because the legislature, I'm afraid, works for the interest of agribusiness and works for the interest of developers and does not work for the public health interest of the people of Florida.
Hi, everybody. My name is Parisima Tayeb. I am an internal medicine physician in Fort Myers. I'm very honored to be here and to be invited by the Calusa Waterkeeper with all these brilliant people on the panel, which I feel really small sitting next to them. The reason I became a physician is because it's basically my passion is to help people, to help my community, to treat them, to make sure that they are educated, to have the sources that they need to protect themselves and their families. So when this health crisis happened last year with the algae crisis that we are facing, I had patients who were being turned away by their own physicians, whether it was ER, whether it was their primary care doctors, and they were blown off. They had no idea what symptoms were caused by. So my job as a physician, as a public health provider, was to make sure they're educated, to raise awareness, to make sure for their safety and for their well-being. So that's why I got very involved in this. The most important thing is for all of you to be educated, and for everybody in this room to educate others, and also for us, for everybody in this room, to educate their own primary care physicians. Believe it or not, a lot of them actually still are blowing off patients. So, and the Department of Health too, they're not doing what they need to be doing. So the most important thing is to get involved, to be activists, and basically to stay safe, to do everything you can to save our waters too. Thank you so much.
I'm Robert Zarantz. I'm an otolaryngologist. Ours is one of the longest residencies because it takes 3 years to learn how to pronounce our specialty. We do ear, nose, and throat and diseases related to the ear, nose, and throat. I can easily say that all the talent here is to my right. And whenever I came here to the initial panels, I was very humbled looking at the talent that we have. And today, as I was sitting there in an earlier panel, I just realized that I'm scared. I'm scared that we're drawing this kind of talent to our community. And when you really think about what that means, these are people that are world known, they're amazing scientists, amazing physicians, and for them to come here and for us to have drawn attention, it's not good. And my job is to basically, as an educator, and I saw one of my students on the video earlier, to bring it to the medical community and try to educate the community through our doctors, nurses, mid-level providers. Nobody's going to do this for us. And I guess I've been on panels with Howard too much because I was never an activist, and I didn't like activism. But now I'm worried that I go, well, I listen to him and I go, things are really worse. The legislature not working for us, our executive not working for us. I just got back from out of town, and I read an article on the newest commissioner in Lee County. And this is kind of all local politics, but I just want to use it as an example. I'm not picking on anybody. Yes, I am. And I want to show you the strata and how many levels things are wrong. They tout this wonderful fellow, I'm sure, as being, and I quote the media, he's an advisor to his clients on health care. And I go, wow, here's a guy that knows something about health care. This is wonderful. And then I look to see what advice he gives his clients. It's on real estate in health care. This man is a developer, and they brag about developing over 1,537,096 square feet of property. We don't need more development. We need more attention to the problems that the development has caused. We need to hold everybody's feet to the fire, whether it's your physician like me, whether it's the media for reporting things in a sort of a skewed way and making us think differently, and hold all the elected officials' feet to the fire. This has got to stop. We don't know, and we really don't have the answers, and I don't want to be an alarmist, but we don't know whether we're going to be sitting here 10 years from now and not remembering that we were here. And that's scary. And I certainly want to pass a better environment for my girls who've been working with us very hard, and I want to thank them also. Thank you.
So we now move to the question portion of this. Some of them were general questions. A couple of people asked, where can we see this movie? We're going to show it, live stream it for our members. So if you're a member, you'll get notification about that soon. If you're not, you can become a member. Then we'll figure out, we're probably going to do a screening of it on the East Coast and a screening of it on the West Coast. We'll figure out after that how we get the movie out to the public. Yeah. We'll try to get it out as soon as we can. So here's a question from Jessica Blanks, who is a ranger, and she's addressing it jointly to Larry Brand and David Davis. Do you see an age effect of life stage when assessing level of toxin in apex predators, or dolphins, dogs, or humans? Younger animals have less aging. Jessica? See back for extra clarification. Wow. Wow. Or separately, not necessarily age, but an accumulation effect with longer exposure of toxin. So that was directed to Larry Brand and David Davis, but Paul Cox will probably be able to weigh in on that. Larry, you have an opinion about that? Is age affecting the age of a predator, of an apex predator or of a mammal? Does that affect their susceptibility?
You would expect it would, but we just don't have enough data on it. I mean, we had relatively few dolphins that we looked at. We just got what samples we could.
Right.
So, but certainly these are the type of toxins that accumulate with age. I mean, think about Alzheimer's. Well, these neurodegenerative diseases, those tangled proteins accumulate with age and slowly kill off your brain neurons and stuff. But the same with all these other toxins that we know about, not just the ones we're talking about tonight, but a lot of other toxins, ciguatoxin and so on. Is that they biomagnify up the food chain, and the older animals at the top of the food chain tend to have the highest concentrations.
Yeah, David?
So that's correct. We actually looked at,
Closer.
actually measured.
Closer to the mic.
Can everyone hear me?
That's better.
I'm sorry. So yeah, what Larry's saying is correct. I mean, as the toxin will bioaccumulate with age, and we looked at dolphins, juvenile and older. They all have the toxin. They all have pathology, but we just didn't have a large enough sample size to say that younger dolphins or older dolphins were more affected. But the take-home message is that they were all affected. So.
All right, next question. This comes from Mitzi Schwartz of Fort Myers. And she's a healthcare provider, I think. By the way, how many healthcare providers do we have in the room? Oh, that's awesome. Wow. Wow. I mean, that is so heartening, because we really wanted to communicate with healthcare providers, and the next thing we're going to do is provide these continuing medical education courses so that we can try to get this information to you so you can in turn convey it to the public. So really, really happy to have so many healthcare providers in the room. Thank you for coming. So Mitzi asks, is there guidance for testing and treatment protocols for BMAA, knowing it hits the serine receptor? So that's probably a Paul Cox question.
We finished a phase 1 clinical trial that Dr. Bradley was our clinical advisor on, showing that serine up to 30 grams per day is safe for ALS patients. We unexpectedly found indications that there's a dose-related effect. It slowed the patients down at the highest dose by about 85%. Put in perspective, typical ALS patients die between about 2.5 to 3 years after diagnosis. Some, of course, live much longer. Our patients are going 5 to 6 years after diagnosis. So the FDA gave us a license to try to see if we can replicate that. And currently, Dr. Elijah Stommel, who you saw in the film, is the principal investigator of a trial for 50 ALS patients at Dartmouth Medical School. And then the FDA also gave us license to study 40 early-stage Alzheimer's patients. So those trials are underway. At this point, we're not prepared to encourage people to take L-serine. We're under FDA license. It's still an investigational drug. But we're very interested to see what happens in those trials. And if they work, well, that'd be a great thing. We'll let you know right away.
This is a question from Lewis, a friend of ours, Lewis Eason. Are these HABs present in the lakes and ponds of golf course communities? If so, what actions should these communities take? It's not directed at any particular panelist. Anybody want to take a shot at that?
Do not lick your balls.
Yoda. Well, I mean, this is a concern for people who live in Naples. You know, Naples has the highest number of golf courses per capita in America. And I did speak to Elijah Stommel about this, and he said there's a very high likelihood that people who play a lot of golf may have an increased risk of cyanobacteria exposure for a couple of reasons. Those ponds that are on the golf courses often accumulate cyanobacteria. So that's one issue. And the fertilizer sprayed on golf courses, and it's sprayed abundantly on golf courses, can also be a cause of cyanobacteria. So he actually thinks, he was cautious about it, but he said he warned people that they may be increasing their risk if they play a lot of golf. So, Joyce Johnson of Estero asks, do city, county water systems check for cyanobacteria? So John Cassani.
So the public water supplies that are important are those that take their source from surface water. There's just one public water supply facility in the county, that's the Olga Water Treatment Plant. They do periodically, once a month, check for the raw and the finished product. And typically the outcome there is pretty good. There was some treated water that had a residual, I think in 2005, but it was rare. So that's the good news. The recreational exposure, though, is where we feel most of the risk exists. So drinking water supply is pretty good.
Samantha Montague of Nokomis, Florida, says, I am raising two boys, 9 and 16, who live to skateboard, surf, fish, and boat. To what extent am I risking their health by living here? They do not go in the water when it's bad, but is it always?
Well, I know a few months ago we had big blooms of the cyanobacteria in Lemon Bay, as well as Sarasota Bay. So it sounds like our boys knew not to go swimming or anything at that time. But another problem we have here is people notice blooms when they form the surface scum. But when that scum goes away, that doesn't mean the cyanobacteria have gone away. A lot of times they've just dispersed down into the water column. So if you sample down below, you'll find they're still there. And other times they're sitting on the bottom. Particularly in the shallow waters, you'll see a thick layer of these cyanobacteria on the bottom. So that's another issue in that even if you don't see those blooms, that doesn't mean there's no toxins in that water.
So one of the sorts of research that scientists like me do is to do what is called case control studies. So you look at patients with ALS and you look at other individuals who don't have a disease and see what they're exposed to, see what they record as having been the things that they do in their life. And there is an increased risk of patients with ALS to do water sports, water skiing in particular, being exposed to fishing and water sports. The other part of that story is that people who do water skiing, and when you collect nasal swabs, you will find that they have an increased amount of microcystins in their nasal swabs. So that's another piece of that detective story that I was mentioning a little earlier in one of our sessions. If you are out there doing water skiing or any of the other sports particularly if there's an algal bloom, then you are at risk of getting a greater exposure to the cyanobacteria. You obviously want to be out there and enjoying the water, but nevertheless, certainly don't do it at a time when there are these algal blooms.
I just want to say my heart's really touched by that question. You shouldn't have to come to a dinner to see a film to meet with scientists to have your government tell you if it's safe or not. When we made a film called Toxic Puzzle, and I think there's some copies the Waterkeepers are selling here. When we came out to film, and I walked down the St. Lucie River, there were 11 dead manatees, 11. And when I went up to, and in Stewart County, somebody put up some signs saying, stay out of the water. When I went up to Lake Okeechobee, there were local people there coming up asking me, why are you wearing an aspirator? Why do you have all this stuff on? Because their children were picnicking, swimming, fishing in Okeechobee. The government, at a minimum, should be giving you rapid information so you can make decisions. The threat of cyanobacterial exposure and toxins is not constant. It pulses. When they release something that comes down the St. Lucie River from Okeechobee, you ought to be the first people that know. And you ought to be able to have that without having to come talk to a scientist. You should hear it directly from your government, and then they say, keep your kids out of the water for a couple of days. That's all it takes. If you have information, you can protect yourselves. But if you don't have information, you're like the poor people I met around Lake Okeechobee who had no idea about the dangers they're exposing their children to.
So the comment that I wanted to make follows directly on the heels of what Paul said. Of all the policy changes that need to be made, the very first one is just what Paul referred to, and that's a threat warning protocol. The state of Florida should be required to warn people when the threat of cyanobacteria is such that it is unsafe to use the water, to go near the water, to eat the fish in the water, to recreate in the water. We do a lousy job of that. We're not the only places in the world where harmful algae blooms are a problem. Lucas County in Toledo, Ohio, Lake Erie has a major problem with harmful algae blooms, but they have a more sophisticated protocol, and when it gets up to a certain level, they shut off the valves of drinking water, they put up signs, they notify people. Of all the policy changes I'd like us to talk about, this is number one. An obligation on the part of the government to warn the people when the water is not safe.
Thank you. I just want to add to that how important policy change is and how much it's needed. We need to translate this information from science into public policy, including regulations with teeth for stopping all nutrient loading at every source. We need enforcement. So we've gone the opposite direction underneath our current governor administration. So we need to stop, we need to speak up about all sources, whether they're big agriculture, septic tank, fertilizing your lawn. It's all got to stop. We all have to change. We all have to change, including sugar.
As physicians, we had very, very little impact on getting our patients to stop smoking. When the personal injury attorneys started suing the tobacco companies, all of a sudden, everybody took notice. I think at some point, we're going to need the support of the legal community to start filing lawsuits and personal injury suits on some of the damages that is being caused at this point.
I just have one thing to add, like everybody else reiterated, I'm going to reiterate. So the toxin concentrations, the signs need to be put up by the Department of Health as well as their health risks. That's the most important thing because the community needs to know when they have to go to the water, when they cannot go to the water. A lot of people have underlying chronic diseases, they have cancers, they're on immunocompromised medications, chemotherapy, so they need to know what to do. If they should go to the water. But if you do have, as the question asked, the mom is concerned about her sons. So if they do have chronic lung issues or underlying asthma, COPD, I would be concerned about if they do have risks of, if they are complaining of symptoms of shortness of breath, cough, asthma flare-ups, I would not go. But the critical issue right now is the signs, the health risk signs that need to be put up. And also, the critical thing right now is that we don't know the long-term low exposure to these toxins. So, thank you.
One thing that came up earlier this afternoon, and to fully kind of understand some of the frustration dealing with policy, is that even to this very day, cyanotoxins are unregulated contaminants in this country, and that's what creates much of the state-to-state variation in policy and guidance on swim guidance and so forth. So we have asked the state to adopt the 2 cyanotoxins that EPA just 2 months ago, after 3 years of research, finalized. Concentrations for microcystin and cylindrospermopsin, and if the state does that, we will finally be, to some extent, a regulated contaminant for these important environmental toxins. We've got to get to that first step where they are regulated contaminants. So there's no longer a discretionary policy action. They're required to do it by law. And that's what we need as a first step. So we have the science. The science is spectacular. It's, in many cases, it's a smoking gun. It tells us what we should and have to be doing, but we have to have that policy nexus. And we've got 20 some odd other states that have actionable criteria. They've actually, their state legislature has adopted actionable criteria. We're just trying to get there in Florida now. It's all discretionary up to this point in time.
Okay. You know, we're here really talking about research science and those on the front lines, but everybody's hankering to get into advocacy and policy, which is great, because that's what it's going to take to start fixing these problems. Next question. This is from Sandra Villamizar in Naples. How is animal agriculture related to the algae blooms, and what can we do to prevent algae blooms? I think we're going to give that to Larry.
Well, north of Lake Okeechobee, you have large areas of dairy farms and cattle ranches, and they are a major source of nutrients coming down the Kissimmee River into the lake. And of course, then those nutrients come from the lake down the Caloosahatchee River. So, yeah, they are a major source of, not the only source, but they are a major source of nutrients that are feeding these blooms.
So let me add to what Professor Brand has said. It is not a secret what the source of the problem is. It's what the scientists call nutrient loading, excess nutrients, meaning largely excess nitrogen and phosphorus. Where do nitrogen and phosphorus come from? I have to say largely from human and animal waste. Biosolids, which is a euphemism for essentially sewage, sludge, leaky septic tanks, nitrogen-based fertilizers, stormwater runoff from nitrogen-based fertilizers, and so on. Those are, now there's a lot we don't know. It's a complex issue. Nobody really knows what percentage, and it may depend upon what the concentration is, for example, of septic tanks in a densely populated area rather than a rural area, so on and so on. There's a lot that to be known that's unknown. But it's clear that those are the principal sources of excess nitrogen. And what has to be done to protect that or to prevent that are clearly policies that that involve things like septic to sewer conversion, or at the very least septic tank inspections, or why do we even tolerate new developments that still use septic tanks, or limitation on the use of agricultural biosolids and so on. So look, as I tried to say before, none of that was even dealt with by the legislature. Some of that didn't even get a hearing. Look, I'm not right in everything I say, and I apologize if I'm wrong, but I thought one of the things that was most outrageous, given where we are in the state, is I don't think a single member of the Lee County or Collier County legislative delegation even proposed legislation to address some of these problems.
Another simple solution, if we cannot reduce what's there now, is stop increasing and stop the future. And that can easily be done by impact fees. And all we hear from our legislatures are how to reduce impact fees so we can build more stuff and have more people come down. The laws are in the books. You can just raise your impact fees and make the developers pay for the future damage, or pay for ways to mitigate the future damage.
All right. So kind of, actually, this is a question for Dr. Cox. When will we be able to have BMAA and microcystin determined by our doctors in human tissue?
At this point, the technology does exist to understand microcystin exposure. Microcystin is a very potent liver toxin. Around Lake Taihu in China, there's a whole cluster of people with primary liver cancer triggered by that. In 2016, from the samples I collected by the St. Lucie River, and again, the local people there were calling the viscous cyanobacterial blooms guacamole. We took it back to our laboratory in Jackson Hole. We found that the microcystins exceeded by 20,000 times the maximum amount allowed by the World Health Organization for recreational waters. And we predicted in print that there will be, in the future, a whole map of primary liver cancer along people who are exposed at the St. Lucie River. BMAA is a different story. We're still trying to understand it. It's a weird toxin. It's not like you get exposed once and then you get sick. It seems it's frequency and chronicity of exposure that causes it. But what we don't know is what's the minimum level that you can take. It might be like radiation. You don't want any of it. It just accumulates through time. We just don't understand. And I think there's been, rightly so, criticism of my work in the scientific literature, because I'm telling you now, there are things we don't understand. It's like if I saw your house with a fire over in the kitchen, I don't want to wait till the whole thing burns down before I let you know it might be wise to act. And so people say, are you alarmed? My answer is, hell yes, I'm alarmed. This is scary to me. I don't want to see these people here hurt. And so we don't understand the magnitude of the problem. We don't understand exactly how the toxin functions. This is what much we know, that in these 2 villages in Guam where people are exposed to the same toxin being produced by your cyanobacteria, 25% years later started dying from ALS, Alzheimer's, and Parkinson's disease. What we do know is that when we expose vervet monkeys in St. Kitts to that same amount that the people in Guam had, that they all come down with Alzheimer's type neuropathology. This is work that Dr. Davis did. So as scientists, we have to be clear there's a lot of things we don't understand here, and we're still working as fast as we can, but what we have seen scares us, and that's why we're here tonight.
Scott from Cape Coral says, is there any environmental deregulation that is suspected of causing our current water conditions?
Well, no, we're not seeing regulations or policies reversed. The problem is they're just not enforced. So that's my experience over the years, is that we see excuses like of funding, or what's the old saying, there's never enough science if there's no political will kind of thing. But we do have policies. Florida has relatively good policies. We're just not funding them and implementing them and enforcing them in an appropriate way. Even things like signage, just informing people of known, definitive public health risk. It's difficult to get signage out there. We have policies on the books to do it, and we're wrangling with Florida Department of Health right now, just putting out signs in areas already verified impaired for fecal indicator bacteria. It's like pulling teeth. It shouldn't be this hard. And we understand what some of the implications are, but we need to be way more progressive and moving quicker in resolving some of these issues.
John, at this point, I am involved in a lawsuit against the city of Cape Coral and the Department of Environmental Regulations. They wanted to change, well, I don't want to go into the whole story, but they wanted to remove a lock. And the removal of that lock would add an additional 30,000 pounds of nitrogen to the river a year. And they thought it was totally acceptable. Yes, and the commission basically agreed with that. And we took them to court, and we're in litigation against them now. John was one of our key witnesses, and we hope that we can stop that. But it's unacceptable to the kind of problems we have, just decide, okay, we're just going to dump an extra 30,000 pounds of nitrogen a year into this endangered river.
I want to say I generally agree with everything John says, but John, here's one example of a rollback. The Environmental Protection Agency recommends that septic tanks be inspected every 3 years and unloaded every 5 years. Now, I know septic tanks is controversial. It depends, as I said earlier, on their density and their, well, the Florida Department of Health says that 40% of the 2.4 million septic tanks that are buried in Florida are buried in environmentally sensitive areas. But in any event, the EPA recommends inspection every 3 years and dumping out every 5 years. Florida had a law up till 2000, that was enacted in 2010, that required septic tank inspections every 3 years. In 2012, with the support of then Governor Rick Scott, that law was repealed. In the last legislative session, 2 Republican members of the legislature, a freshman from Bradenton, and the president and the Joe Gruters from Sarasota proposed to reinstate the mandatory 3-year inspection of septic tanks. It didn't even get a hearing.
Just to clarify a little bit, the context of what I was describing was more from a state context, state policy. What's going on in DC right now is just abysmal. It's a total abdication on many levels, particularly the WOTUS rule, the Waters of the United States, the rule that defines what waters are eligible for Clean Water Act protection. That's being dismantled. It's being proposed to be diminished extensively. So there are examples at the federal level for sure. We're going backwards in the context of federal law, but state's a little better, I'd argue.
One thing I just want to add to that, I want to say the word environmental justice and the intersectionality between our algae bloom problems and the poorest communities in our state. They're the ones that are getting hurt the worst. Just one example in Lee County is Charleston Park, that has a completely flawed septic system, and nobody will help them. They all go to the community center to get drinking water in Charleston Park. This is happening in our county. This isn't about cyanobacteria right now, but it is about our responsibility as citizens to take care of all of us, because clean water should be a right for all of us. And we as Calusa water keepers, we are working on these issues as well. Another example is Billy's Creek, right near downtown, that is completely contaminated with fecal indicator bacteria right now. And so we are in dialogue with the Department of Health, but it's slow. We're going to keep pushing. John and I have been really pushing, and a few of you out there have been too, so I thank you for your advocacy. If you get sick, if you have to see a clinician or a doctor, please do call and demand that the health department knows about it, even if they try to refer you to someone else. Let's flood them with phone calls, and let's flood poison control with phone calls. And yes, let's work on some kind of a call-in tracking system that we can develop statewide. Thank you.
Okay, so Dar Lucas from Sarasota asks, we can avoid the water, but we can't avoid the air. How do we protect our house inside, our homes, our house inside environments, and what type of filters should we use? She got no response from the CDC.
Yeah, we don't know the answer to that right now. I'm actually writing a proposal right now to get money to do that, to test various types of masks, respirators, and so on, and also test whether air conditioning systems on homes might filter out these toxins. So right now, we really do not know. We need to find that out.
Yeah, Elijah Stummel made reference to that too, because as you know, Legionnaire's disease was very clearly determined that a lot of the disease propagation was through air conditioning filters, and he suspects the same thing is true of cyanobacteria, but we need to do a little more work, a lot more work, to try to assess the risks from air conditioning systems or water towers or even your commercial air conditioning systems. Dee Dee Cheek from Cape Coral asks, the Blue-Green Algae Task Force, will they make a difference? And by the way, this is one of our chief advocacy initiatives, is to try to push the government, the state government, to reinstitute the Blue-Green Algae Task Force. And it was at the top of our 10-point hit list for HABs a year and a half ago that John put together. We were very pleased that it's now become a reality. So I'll let John answer that question.
Oh, he always saves the easy ones for me. So we talked a little bit about at the press conference how policy and politics, the nexus between those two things. And, you know, I think the task force has an incredible group of appointed individuals that are incredible scientists in their own right. But we saw what happened with the legislature this year. There were opportunities to move forward quickly on things like stormwater treatment criteria. All those bills died on the vine this year. And we're thinking, you know, is it really about throwing more money at the problem? And those of us who have been doing this for years, we can't really buy our way out of this problem. So it's, you know, 1 foot forward, 2 steps back. We're loading these waters faster than we are cleaning up. The rate of impairment is increasing faster than we're restoring these water bodies. We can't keep that trajectory going. So the task force has this incredibly hard task ahead of them, how to cut through the politics. And some of the comments we made just recently was, tell the legislature what they need to hear, okay? What they should hear. You got to tell them that. You can't put bookends on how you're going to advise the legislature on these important policy decisions. So I hope they'll do that. I want to believe they will do that. We need to support that process along the way. We need to show public support for it as it goes forward. Otherwise, bad things can happen when the politics get into the equation. So support it, hope for the best, and we'll keep pushing along, trying to get these standards adopted as official water quality standards here in the state of Florida. So we're all kind of working in the same direction. Hope the task force will do what it's mandated to do.
I want to add just a little bit to what John said. Look, the Blue-Green Algae Task Force is one of the good accomplishments of the Calusa Waterkeeper and other groups. And the task force, which is composed of some very, very good people, they've had, I think, 3 meetings now. And what we've heard from them so far, I've heard 2 things that really made me feel very good. They said at their first meeting that voluntary best management practices don't seem to be working to regulate agriculture. And they also said we got to get serious about septic tanks. So I've heard some very good things. The rubber will hit the road when, number one, how long will it take them to make their recommendations? And number 2, what happens when their recommendations hit not the governor's office, but the legislature? Because some of the what they have to do is going to have to be enacted by the legislature. But look, there have been some really good accomplishments. The change from the DeSantis administration, from the Scott administration to the DeSantis administration, has been really dramatic. We're early on in the, we're only 7 months into it yet. You know, there's reason to be skeptical, but some of the changes that have been made, including the task force, including firing the members of the South Florida Water Management Board, and putting in place people who prioritize public health, we would be probably suffering from blue-green algae right now if the new management, if public advocacy didn't have an impact on the new South Florida Water Management Board, which put pressure on the Army Corps of Engineers to change the discharge schedule. So they discharged water when the lake was at a low level and not at the high level during the rainy season when it was filled with harmful algae blooms. And were it not for that, and that happened as a result of public advocacy.
Yeah, so a couple of people have asked, how does this year compare to last year? I mean, the conditions are a little bit different this year. In last year, in May and June, we had record rainfall, and this year we had record under amount of rainfall in May and June. So that contributed a lot. And then, as Howard said, the Army Corps of Engineers miraculously found a latitude in their regulations that they had never found before. So I don't know whether it had to do with our lawsuit or public pressure or a tumult of a public outcry, but they exercised discretion when they had always in the past said they were not able to exercise any discretion. So that is promising. I'm going to let John talk about this year versus last year.
This year ain't over yet, folks. I mean, I kind of wished it was. It's kind of like a Twilight Zone thing. When will it end? So I can remember in 05, the bloom was in August and September. In 07, it was July, August, you know. So it's been different so far in that we've seen some different species. It hasn't just been microcystin with the cyanobacteria. We've had some other, what you might call minor species, and we haven't seen the surface scums accumulate like we did last year. What's interesting, though, is we see the pigment that cyanobacteria produces, called phycocyanin, it levels much higher than we've seen last year. And this could be because much of the cell density is distributed in the water column vertically. So we kind of think it's there. We hope it's not. We hope it won't come back. But we're just kind of holding our breath, hoping that it'll be turn out to be a better year than last year. I think what you want to hear, though, is the big difference between this year and last year is we weren't getting 6,000, 7,000, 8,000 cubic feet per second, largely as a result of lake releases starting June 1st of last year. That we had a deviation from the lake regulation schedule that gave us moderate deliveries of water throughout much of the dry season and took the lake down pretty low. And a lot of people got really nervous about that. But hey, we haven't seen what we saw last year. So is it proof of cause and effect? I'm not sure I'd go that far, but it sure looks that way to me. So this is where policy can have a huge impact.
One thing we're noticing in Wyoming is that people from Sarasota north have been sending us samples of Lingvia mats. Just citizens contacting us. They're washing up along the beaches. They look sort of like a textile. And we've been analyzing them in our laboratory. And just tonight I got the results from our lab that we're finding higher neurotoxin concentrations in those things washing up on the beaches than we even measured last year in the cyanobacterial blooms coming down the St. Lucie River. So, I'm grateful that the Caloosahatchee is not being the fount right now of trouble, but we're not out of the water here. There's Lingvia mats north of Sarasota up towards Tampa, and we're worried because we're seeing toxins in these as well. So.
One thing I just wanted to say, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it's my understanding that once there's been a bloom of cyanobacteria in any certain location, that under the right conditions, that particular location will have a bloom again, and not only will it bloom again, it will be more concentrated and stronger. Is this true? I've read this a few times, so I want to put this out there about the frequency of blooms where they've already happened.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of times they produce cysts and so on, and so they can just hide out in the sediment at the bottom and so on. So, yeah, I mean, you always have low levels of algae. So, I mean, in a sense, you always have really low levels of toxins around. We've been exposed to that, well, forever, essentially. So again, the issue is the high concentrations of nutrients. It's when you get these excess amounts of algae, now you're exposed to high concentrations of nutrients. It's not going to necessarily be higher and higher forever. It depends upon how much nutrients you add to these blooms. So, I mean, like, again, from last year to this year, we have lower concentrations of nutrients coming from the land and lower concentrations of algae on average. Depends on if we get a hurricane coming through, a lot of rainfall, and we start washing more nutrients in, those blooms are going to come back.
A question for Paul. What is your recommended daily dose of L-serine? And is there a certain brand recommended?
No, I'm under FDA license, and the FDA considers L-serine as an investigational drug, so we're not ready to beat the drum on this one. We really need to finish our clinical trials to see if it's efficacious in treating these diseases and preventing it. That said, you can look this up on the web. We've published our analysis of a village in northern Japan, Ogimi Village, on the northern tip of Okinawa, where there's no record of any of these diseases. And the people there are getting, through their diet of seaweeds and tofu and other agricultural products, about 4 times the amount of L-serine that North Americans get. In North America, the average American from all sources gets about 3 grams a day of L-serine, and they're getting 9 to 12 grams a day in Ogimi Village, so just saying.
And they live longer. They live longer than any other.
Yeah, they live to be about 104, 105. They have absolute recall back to the time they're 4 or 5 years old. They move like ballerinas. I can't keep up with them. And they reach to be about 105, 106, and they just go to sleep one night and don't wake up. So, but I'm not prepared to say anything about that experimental treatment.
By the way, the movie Toxic Puzzle that really speaks about Dr. Cox's work. We have copies of it for sale out in the lobby. And if you haven't seen it, I do recommend you watch that movie. It's an amazing, extraordinary piece of work by Boland, and it really describes a lot of these gentlemen and ladies are in that movie as well, and it really describes Paul Cox's groundbreaking work on that issue. This is a question from Gene Gibson. The CDC is currently testing Lake O fishermen. How are those tests going? And how, let's see, and are they able to get a sufficient number of subjects to conduct this study? You know anything about that, Larry?
Well, you know more about it.
Actually, I don't know about this. I've heard whispers about it, but I don't know that the CDC has actually started doing anything. I think there's talk about it. It would be interesting. I think it would be much more interesting to look at the whole of Florida, and certainly, as Paul had suggested, to use the area in Fort Myers and Cape Coral here as the epicenter for the study, because this is a much bigger population. Obviously, there are not very many fishermen on Lake Okeechobee. There are ways that you could design a study, but I think the better thing is to put the money and the center here in Fort Myers.
I don't know all the details, but my understanding is the U.S. Congress gave the CDC about $1 million to do a study on Lake Okeechobee. And I don't know if they've actually started yet, but they're going to be starting certainly within a year. And I think they have money for do a one-year study and so on. But, the bottom line is, you can't expect results on this type of difficult research in a few months. I know people want answers right away, but it takes time to get these results. So.
We may have inadvertently messed up their study, though, when we were doing the filming at Lake Okeechobee during the 2016 cyanobacteria bloom. The filmmakers and myself would go to the Burger King there and run in, and we had a white powder, which happened to be L-serine, and we'd drop it into our milkshakes and then keep chugging it down. And I really felt bad because the tourists saw us moving these big packages of white powder and then drinking it, and they started sort of backing off from us. So I hope I haven't forever messed up the study, because some of the kids were watching and they thought that might be a pretty nice thing to try.
Dave Urick asks, tell us more about the role of nitrogen. That might be a Larry Brand question.
I guess the question is basically the role of nitrogen in algal blooms, right?
Yeah, and also maybe get into the water flowing south and how
Right,
that
okay.
could exacerbate the problem.
The two major nutrients you have to be worried about are nitrogen and phosphorus, okay? And I won't go into all the gory details of this, but because we have a rather peculiar, what we call biogeochemistry here in Florida. So some water bodies in Florida, phosphorus is the problem that causes the blooms. In other places, nitrogen causes the problem. This is really important to know because the policymakers in the state still don't seem to understand this basic concept. I testified before the Army Corps of Engineers in South Florida Water Management District about this 20 years ago when the $15 billion Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan, I pointed out just fundamental, simple flaws, scientific flaws in that plan. They totally ignored it. But basically, broad generalization, the Everglades and Biscayne Bay are phosphorus limited. Phosphorus is the nutrient of concern. When you go down to Florida Bay and all along the West Coast, nitrogen is the one of concern, okay? Right now, they put a lot of effort into taking phosphorus out of the water that's coming out of the sugarcane farms going down into the Everglades. That was the basis of the 1988 federal lawsuit of the state allowing the sugarcane farmers to pollute the Everglades, okay? From that, they assumed all of Florida was phosphorus limited and phosphorus was the problem. They only are dealing with the phosphorus issue, and they basically ignored. They'll give lip service to nitrogen, but they basically have done nothing about taking nitrogen out of the water. It's a fundamental flaw.
By the way, we're going to ask another question or two off the cards, and then we're going to open it up to the floor, because some questions might have been provoked by what you heard or by the movie. So if you have a question you'd like to ask, come down and just make a line behind this microphone right in front of me. If anybody has an impromptu question they want to ask, you're welcome to do that. Here's a question from Patience Burke in St. Petersburg. The Downs model instructs us that catastrophes open up windows of opportunity for repair in broken legislation. In social systems, the key is having an answer ready Do we have an answer ready?
Another easy one. And Howard will have a follow-up, which is great. Oh my. So, the sort of the cumulative experience of doing this for decade after decade, dealing with policy and the nexus to science, and now we're understanding it's not just that, there's a social element to it as well. And I guess my answer would be yes. But I'm not sure exactly what that answer exactly is. We have a mandate before us. We have an imperative before us now. We have to fix this problem using whatever tools we have, cultural, scientific, economic. We have to fix this sooner than later. We can't wait. People are getting sick. People are making life decisions about leaving this community. I get calls, several calls a month saying, I've already left, I sold my properties, I'm gone. It's tragic. So whatever answer we need, whether it's social, cultural, economic, political, we just have to do it. And I wish I had a definitive answer for you. I think some of it has to be done in sequence, and we're trying to do that, getting these cyanotoxins as regulated contaminants. We think that's an important first step. So I'm sure others could contribute on the social question or answer.
Well, at the risk of, I don't want to sound overly simplistic, but I think that there is an answer, and some of it was just mentioned earlier by Larry Brand. The problem is excess nutrients in Florida freshwater, nitrogen and phosphorus. And we have to address what are the sources of excess nutrients. And then that puts us into this realm of politics where it takes courage, because the sources of it largely come from agribusiness and development, and the unregulated use of fertilizers by developers, and the stormwater runoff and the runoff of from animal feeding areas from agribusiness that are largely north and west of Lake Okeechobee that feed into the Kissimmee River Basin. Everybody is so focused on what comes out of Lake Okeechobee, what comes out of Lake Okeechobee. We need to be focused on what goes into Lake Okeechobee. And that requires us to have the guts to get our politicians and our political leaders to have the guts to confront agribusiness and developers and impose restrictions on them, because their work is slowly poisoning the people of Florida.
I'd just like to add to that. I was on a Zoom conference call this morning with some very brilliant individuals. One of them is Ted Brown, who is a retired professor of chemistry. And he just said something that I wanted to say tonight. And he said, if we do not begin to adapt and implement regenerative agriculture, we're doomed, period. We have to change agriculture itself.
I just want to say something quick. It's as small a part the smallest part we could do as individuals is clean out our own septic tanks if you have any, especially those who live close to the water, and stop using fertilizers, period. Don't listen to your lawnmower guys. So.
Here's a question from Patty Whitehead, who lives in Estero. How about the uptick in Vibrio infections? Is there an increased public health risk? And should this be addressed in conjunction with cyanobacteria?
My team in Wyoming has been looking at bacteria that actually use cyanobacteria as sort of a feeding ground, like cows on a meadow. And so we've been using a number of DNA primers. This is work done by Mrs. Souza and a very gifted bacteriologist, and Dr. Metcalf. And we're worried about this. There's incidents off Bangladesh when large cyanobacterial blooms in the ocean have preceded massive cholera infections. So this is unknown science again, but it appears that we're not just dealing with one or two species of cyanobacteria. We're dealing with a whole ecosystem of bacteria, some of which are very pathogenic, coming with these cyanobacterial blooms. So stay tuned.
By the way, we're going to start a study of Vibrio next year because we want to expand our public health campaign to include not only HABs, but other waterborne toxins, other bacteria on our fresh waterways. Someone asked the question, what happens to cyanobacteria when it hits salt water? I mean, that's a pretty basic question, but I think, Larry, you want to hit that?
Yeah, we saw this all last year when you had massive amounts of flow down the river, and so you had large amounts of cyanobacteria going right on out into the Gulf, and you actually saw these things on the beaches. I think of Sanibel and Fort Myers Beach and so on. This particular species, the Microcystis, it's actually it's a colony, and it's surrounded by some mucilage. And so initially, as it gets into the saltwater, I mean, it's a freshwater species, so it dies in saltwater, but it's sort of protected by that mucilage. So it lives for a while. It continues to live in the saltwater for a while until the salt makes it through the mucilage and so on. But eventually, it is going to die in salt water. And when it dies, it releases all its nutrients as well, and then the red tide takes it up. Okay, now, I know there's some misconception there. Some people had the impression that the red tide eats the cyanobacteria. They do eat another type, but not the freshwater one that's coming down the river. So it's when those cyanobacteria from the river die, they release those nutrients, and that feeds into the red tide. And that's what we saw last year. When that pulse came down in June, you saw the red tide was already there, but when that pulse of nutrient-rich water came down the river and hit the Gulf, that's when the red tide got much worse, and that's when you started seeing the large amounts of dead fish and other sea life there on the beaches.
Cheryl from Cape Coral asks, what is your opinion of the health effects of glyphosate in our water? That's Roundup. Is that a problem in our waterways, Roundup? What do we know about Roundup?
Well, I'm not going to speak to the health effects directly of glyphosate. Maybe my colleagues would like to. But I know a lot of people have brought this issue up with respect to what extent the glyphosate that they're spraying on the lake and so on, to what extent it affects the cyanobacterial blooms. Now, that molecule does contain both nitrogen and phosphorus, but if you do the calculations, look at the amount of nitrogen and phosphorus in the glyphosate they spray on the lake, it's minuscule compared to all the nutrients that are coming in from the agricultural lands around the lake. So that's not the source or anything. However, what it does do, the reason they're spraying it is because they're killing off the hyacinth and other surface floating plants. Okay? Because when you kill off those, well, let me back up. What those surface floating plants are doing is they're shading the cyanobacteria below. So the cyanobacteria can't bloom too much because they're down below in the low light. On top of that, the hyacinth and other floating plants are taking up a lot of nutrients. You use the glyphosate to kill those surface floating plants. They die, they release all the nutrients. Now the cyanobacteria are not shaded, and that's when you get your big bloom of cyanobacteria. So indirectly what's happening is you spray the glyphosate, you kill off the cyanobacteria's competitors, and now you allow that cyanobacterial bloom to develop, and of course now you have a huge load of toxins. I don't know if, so, does someone have a comment about the human health effects of glyphosate? I mean, there are health effects as well, but I'm not knowledgeable on that.
Gentlemen, so if you would just state your name and your question.
Okay, my name is Joshua Mahalik. I just had a kind of a question about the scope of, like, as you know, citizens of Collier and Lee County, like, what should we be thinking about in terms of our contributions to this crisis? Like, I'm a product development engineer. Like, what can I contribute, and like, what problems are we not solving right now with the technology that we have, the deployable underwater microscope, all of those issues that we've started with? Where can we take that from a technology perspective?
Joshua, one thing that's really made me optimistic as an outsider is that this issue now is bipartisan in Florida. Both political parties support now and are interested in protecting the water supplies and stopping this. Furthermore, I would challenge you to find a way to make all stakeholders win. Figure out a way that everybody wins by having clean water, including developers, including agriculturalists. Instead of sort of pointing fingers at the bad folk, let's make everybody good folks and figure out how people can be rewarded and win for their contributions.
Thanks.
That's what we call being an evolutionary activist, to take that positive approach. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Stephen Blumrosen from Bonita Springs. I've been here for 15 years or so. Probably somebody's expecting me to say something activist. And while I think signs are not enough, we should have sirens and other things. That's not my question. My question is about Dr. Sheriff. I don't know if anybody here knows Dr. Sheriff. He passed away about a year ago. He was a neuro, just about everything that was happening around here was related to what he was working on. He created a whole industry studying the brain, and especially Alzheimer's. He knew he was dying. He left a message to the community here in the news press saying that he was dying of ALS, not Alzheimer's. And he made that very clear distinction. Tonight, many of you seem to be talking about ALS, Alzheimer's, and Parkinson's all in one breath. Has the scientific community pretty much concluded that they're very similar? Thank you.
So I spent my career separating those diseases because they are clinically very, very distinct. And pathologically, David Davis will tell you they're very distinct. But we are beginning to recognize that in many ways they have a genetic underpinning that is very similar. The genes that cause one are probably very similar to the genes that cause other ones. And the environmental factors that cause one may well be similar. And I have this paper that I describe as neuroheresy that says that they may well be very similar, the diseases, because they may well, in fact, be overlapping circles. So in the end, when we know everything, and it will be wonderful when we get to that stage, may well be they are very similar and just different branches of the same picture. We're not there yet. And we certainly still have specialists who deal with each of those individual diseases. But sooner or later, we may come to a picture that he may yet embrace.
You would appreciate that. David, do you have anything you want to add to that?
So I agree with what Dr. Bradley says.
Can you speak into the mic more?
Sorry, I agree with what Dr. Bradley just said about the diseases. I mean, I direct a brain bank, and we have a lot of donors that come in with, both diseases overlapping. So one of those questions are, how does this happen? And we are finding that they do share common genes that would cause one or the other to go. So this is a question we're pursuing. So thank you.
My question is, my county officials, elected officials, are completely in denial that we have any kind of an issue in our water and that we have absolutely no toxins airborne or in our water. And the FDEP keeps telling everyone, keep coming to visit Manatee County because we have no toxins in our water because they're not testing for the things that need to be tested for. So I have been fighting and fighting and fighting and fighting with my elected officials on a daily basis for months. And what can I do to make them finally listen to me? Because we have a public health crisis in our county, and I need attention to be called to this issue, but yet I can't get anywhere. What can I do?
Well, I was just going to ask Dr. Davis, after donors donate their brains to the brain bank, does some to go on to elected careers or? No. Okay, sorry, they're all postmortem, thank you. So keep fighting and keep sending us Slingbia. We'll keep monitoring it for you.
And thank you, Paul Cox. I love you.
just to be serious about that, Dr. Cox and Dr. Metcalf, 2 years ago, 2 years ago, I think, published a paper which collected together all of these samples that they had collected from both west coast and east coast of Florida, pointing out all of the high levels of cyanobacterial and the toxins, and really took to task the public health authorities and what they were not doing about warning the public. And that paper ought to be sent to all of the health authorities in Florida.
Hi, my name is Warren Sherrado. I have a couple of questions that kind of rolling together. One, you talk about Roundup or glyphosate. How was that related to Dicot? Are they the same? Are they similar? Are they very different? Dicot is used by the state in thousands and thousands of gallons to kill off surface water, invasive plants in our lakes and waterways. So there's that part of it. The other side of it is there's a issue right now going on between Fort Myers and Cape Coral, where they're talking about shipping all of the gray water over from Fort Myers to Cape Coral for use in their sprinkler systems. Any idea about what's in that gray water, and is that a bad thing or is that a good thing?
I think this is an ENT surgeon's topic.
You know, we're taking one waste and trying to put it on the other side. And, you know, Cape Coral, I have absolutely no faith in their decisions. When we were dealing with in the lawsuit, we found misdirection, if not dishonesty. We found statements made by their experts that I, as a medical expert, if I ever did that in court, I would be explaining contempt of court. Yet it was just allowed to look the other way. What was even scarier is that at the end of most of the testimony, I had lunch with their experts, and they kind of quietly came to me and said, "Do you think it's dangerous? Do you think my kids are okay swimming in the water?" And I'm going, my God, these are the people that are testifying against us. So don't trust your government officials. I think it's very clear. Let me refer to some notes I had. There's actually an organization called the ISO, and it's an independent, non-government organization. 164 countries belong to it, and they tell you how to deal with problems like we're dealing with. And you have to identify, evaluate, prioritize the risk, and then have a coordinated and economical application of resources to minimize, monitor, and control the probability of impact of the problem. You know, what government entity is doing that? I haven't found one yet, but I think that's what we need to demand of our elected officials. I don't want their brown water.
Hello, and thank you all for being here. I really appreciate this. My name is Joanne Smallwood. I live in Naples, Florida. And I live on Venetian Bay in Naples, Florida. And around May or June, cyanobacteria was discovered in Morings Bay, which connects to Venetian Bay in Naples, Florida, from a lake called Swan Lake. Then on July 4th, I walked out on the bay on my dock and saw a huge scum of green, the thick algae that looked like Lake Okeechobee and Caloosahatchee last year. It was connecting 4 docks, including my own. I contacted the county, I contacted the newspaper, I contacted all the authorities and the DEP. The county came out, said, "Oh, I'm sorry, the person that measures this is not here right now. We can't do that." Contacted the DEP. They came out about 2 weeks later and checked the water. Well, the high tide just changes about 8 feet every day, you know, and washes in and out. So it was gone. So my question to you is that I heard you say the frequency of bloom when it has already been there can happen again. And I was concerned when I knew that it happened from in Morings Bay earlier, that this might be the same cyanobacteria, because it looked like that. And now, by the way, there has been scum since last year's outbreak of other big algae pads that are black and gray and all over the bay, and they've become very much frequent almost daily now, covering the whole end of the bay. So my question is, if it is frequent, could that possibly be, in your opinion, again, cyanobacteria, even though nobody would test it to confirm it?
You know, here's a case where you've got such a wonderful university here, Florida Gulf Coast University, with experts there that can quickly analyze that and let you know. I mean, sometimes there's duckweed that's very small that looks like it's green, but it's not an algae. So again, I think by linking together you with your local experts that can quickly analyze that is the best way. And of course, if you're in desperation, take a little baggie, freeze it, and then send it to us in Wyoming, and we'll take a look and let you know. Okay?
I was just say, you contact me, I'll look at it too. I'm interested. Most likely it is cyanobacteria, yeah.
That's what
I'd be
it
interested
looked
in
like.
take a look at those samples, yeah.
Thank you very
You
much.
can also send pictures to us on Facebook, and John will probably be able to give you a pretty quick reading.
Can I give those? I have them with me. Can I send them to you?
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, you can email it to us, something like that, yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Good evening. My name's Tim Ritchie, and I'm the founder of March Against Mosaic. Again, wonderful evening. Thank you, Casey and John. I heard tonight on the many great things, but the one thing that really blasted me was everybody getting involved. And I believe the last time I was here, I mentioned this. This is a request for a public hearing out in Polk County. This is regarding the Mosaic Bartow South gyp stack and the water permit. And every day per Mosaic, they are discharging 2.6 million gallons of acidic radioactive wastewater, heavy metals. And I have a file here for somebody tonight. This here is a CSA. This is about 1,000 acres. This is maybe 45 to 55 feet high. This is filled to the brim with acidic radioactive wastewater. And what is that on top? We all know what that is. Here's another one. And they have hundreds of these out there. Talking about Manatee, this is Manatee County. This is where they do dredging. This is the most horrific type of mining. And what do we have on top of there with that 70-foot barge? Cyanobacteria everywhere. We are getting this put under the rug by FDEP and DEP. And this coming week and the next week, a few of us are going to be going to the commissioners that are our friends and the mayors, and we are going to request that you guys get some letters to DEP and FDEP, and I have it specifically regarding this permit, because the Althea River, the North Prong, is from one source of pollution, the Bartow Mosaic South gyp stack. That thing is 200 feet tall. Niagara Falls is only 167 feet tall. And we need some help. And I just want to say, we need to start putting Mosaic on top. As far as I'm concerned, Mosaic is the #1 Florida environmental polluter. Thank you, everybody.
I think we have time for one more question, folks.
Good evening to the panel and good evening to the audience. My name is Arenza Thigpen Jr. I'm from Anchorage, Alaska. But for the past 12 years, I've been here in Fort Myers working on ballot initiatives on a local, state, and a state level. Even in Alaska, we have our own problems with clean water. I'm a member of just about every clean water activist program there is in South Florida, especially here in Southwest Florida. My grandfather is from here in Lee County. My grandfather's brother lives in Charleston Park, or did live in Charleston Park. So I'm very familiar with the problems that we have concerning cyanobacteria. My question is really directed towards Mr. Simon because he's known me for years. And my question to you, sir, is this. Are the chances highly likely that our efforts to either create protocol for the safeguards or just in general to make some type of system that we can go by to make sure that we take every effort to clean up as much cyanobacteria as possible? Do you think that this is going to wind up as a statewide ballot initiative?
Hi, Aaron. I haven't seen you in years. Thank you. No, I don't, and not at this point. And I take it from, I want to play off and answer to your question some of the remarks from Dr. Paul Cox, because I think things have changed. And I think Colusa Waterkeeper is significantly responsible for this change. First of all, if you want to change policy, you got to motivate the public. And in order to motivate the public, you have to inform the public. And I think Colusa Waterkeeper, and why I'm so proud to be associated with them now, is they played a significant role in changing the conversation. This is no longer about dead fish on the shore. It's no longer about the impact of the economy. More and more people are understanding that this is a threat to public health. And as Paul Cox said, this is an issue that cuts across political and ideological lines. It's not a Republican concern, it's not a Democratic concern. The two champions in the legislature on septic tanks were both Republicans. I think we have an opportunity with more public education to make this more a nonpartisan issue about public health. And I want to first get that addressed to the legislature before we even think about ballot initiatives. And I think we have an opportunity to that. I believe it's the case that every member of the Florida legislature from this area is termed out. That means all new people are going to be running for office. That means it's your responsibility to make sure that public health is their number one concern.
And can I just add that, is Kat still here, our filmmaker? Where are you? Can you wave your hand? Could you just stand up for a second? I mean, this film she made is dynamite. It's dynamite. And one thing all of you could do is I think you want to get this young woman, this gifted filmmaker, and her film to Tallahassee and have people watch it. You've got to get this film out. It's a tremendous tool. And my hat's off to you, Kat. What a tremendous thing you've done.
One more question.
Hi, guys. Michelle Lesser. I represent a huge group of citizens here that have been paying for their own testing since March. I've tested 28 waterways. We found 14 different cyanobacteria. A lot of those are in drinking water sources. Dr. Cox, you are the one that analyzed, you and Dr. Metcalf analyzed our sample for Lingdia and came up with the BMAA. Two questions. One, can we assume with the BMAA being positive in that sample that we're looking at airborne particles as well? And two, what can I do as somebody that's out there testing and sharing information? What can I do? What can we do as citizens to help you more?
Thank you. The answer to the first question is I don't know. I don't know how important the airborne exposure is. It's being studied by very competent people. I laud Mike Parsons and his team here and all the good folks, Larry Brand. Man, what an amazing wind wave machine you've got over there. So stay tuned. They'll figure that out. I don't have the answer to that. But
we're
secondly,
actually collecting money to buy our own as well and send that to you.
Yeah. The other thing is, we're in a not-for-profit research institute in Jacksonville, Wyoming. We don't have an axe to grind. We don't have a dog in this race, but we care deeply about you. And when we hear from you, when we see your samples, we really jump to try and analyze them. We want to just be a source of objective scientific information, and the Ling BMAT you sent us exceeded by far in BMAA, the samples that were collected last year. So we're really worried about this, and I really want to laud you for bringing it to the attention of the scientists.
Absolutely.
Thank you. I think there might be an opportunity here for what we call citizen scientists. Because you went out and got the samples and sent them clear to Jackson Hole that we even know about this. And I think if the people here started collecting little samples, wear gloves, wear a mask while you collect it, be careful, don't lick the golf balls. And if there could be a freezer where these samples were archived and saved, and if they had a very clear location on them,
Okay.
once they're frozen, they'll last forever. And this is something where all of you could participate to help us get a map of where these toxins are and when they occur. I think that would really help us as scientists. Don't you think so, Professor
Wow,
Brand?
that's fantastic. Thank you so much.
We were just given headquarters on the FGCU campus, and we're going to implement a new lab there. So we might be able to be the repository for those tests, and we can hold them. We're going to start a fundraising campaign for that in a couple of weeks, but we're going to have a more elaborate, we have a lab now, but we're going to have a more elaborate lab in the new headquarters. So we're looking forward to doing that.
One question for that lab. Is that involved with MOAT?
Is it a what?
Is that involved with MOAT?
Yeah, in no way.
Thank you.
All right, let's go. I mean, yeah,
Two
go
quick
ahead.
questions. I'm an elected official out in Lehigh Acres. Dollar Lake being built beside us, C-43. That is supposed to be piping water down the Townsend Canal and back out without any water quality treatment. Lehigh Acres has proposed a water treatment which would flow it through our canals. We have 311 miles. We have a 105-acre filtration system. We have 560 acres within the county for a rock quarry, and we have a natural cypress head. We're asking, my question would be, is that going to help address your nitrate project by flowing it through our system and filtrating it? And two, we are attempting, we have the largest population in Lee County outside of Cape Coral. We have 115,000 people. Our septic tanks impacting the water, basically our population center is 5 to 6 miles away from the Caloosahatchee. Because we're trying to take over the local septic system so that we can, and we need information as to whether or not we will impact the water system if we take that over.
So storage equates to treatment, and I'm so encouraged to see local taxing districts like yours step up to offer potential solutions. We've been asking for a water quality component, the reservoir, since 2005. And we're told at increments of about 5 years that it will happen, but we haven't seen that happen yet. So
We have a request to the Senate and state, the Congress, local state legislation, asking for funding. We are 100 feet away from their canal, 100 feet. We can flow it through ours, as I said, 105 a filtration system that we recently bought, which is in Henry County. With the Lee County cooperation from the commission, they have bought 560 acres, which is known as C10, which is on the map I just presented. And then we have a cypress head. We can flow that back through the water any way they want. We are encouraged, but we would ask your support. As far as the septic system, we have 115,000 people. We have 11,000 customers for the local system, which is controlled by what's called the Florida Government Utility Association. We are looking at exploring the possibility of taking that over, which would allow us to then increase the water service, because of their 11,000, they probably have 4,000 to 5,000 on septics. It's an issue that's coming before us. It's going to cost roughly $88 million, but it funds itself. So that's one of the issues we're looking. And we need to know if we are adversely impacting the river, because that would be a reason to spend that type of money.
Well, you may be aware the estuary up to the Franklin Lock is already verified impaired for nutrient pollution.
Okay.
That means you can't add any more without doing mitigatory compensation. You have, and what you're proposing is that, but you got to crank the numbers. You got to know how much you're going to offset. And I think if you talk to different folks, different agencies, they'll get to that net change that perhaps will enable that to happen.
Well, I also represent the Immokalee Water and Sewer District. The little community of Immokalee has 100% water and sewer, so they have no adverse impact, and that's what we're trying to
You've
sell.
touched on some really important things. How much do septic tanks contribute? And we think that there certainly is some contributing factor, but we don't know how much. And so it's hard to, a lot of times the policymakers hide behind what we don't know. And they want to point fingers to the easy, politically correct area to say, you're the source. And that doesn't always work so well for us. We need to move quickly. We need to move intelligently and assess these systems due haste. And I'm so encouraged to hear that your district is offering these options up. But the regulatory agencies that make those decisions you're asking me questions about, those are the ones you're going to have to deal with along the way. I think you know that.
Well, as you said earlier, it's all politics. So,
well,
thank you very much for
some. And thank you for being here and being so proactive and part of the community. We really appreciate that.
Can I give credit? Can I give credit? It's not me, it's the entire board has been active. And David Lindsay, who's our executive director, has been pushing this. 6 months ago, we were told that there would be no water control system. Governor DeSantis, for his many faults, has required that, and the federal government is now looking to qualify that, and we are trying to offer this as a potential solution.
Try to do that and fix the flooding issues with the extreme rainfall that we're having is really going to be tough. And what you're offering is giving us a little more hope that we may be able to deal with it. But the issues out there are so hard right now. I just can't spin that in a happy way. There's global drivers of change that are making it really hard. Warmer water, more nutrients, 900 people moving to Florida every day. So we have some real challenges, and it's going to take community. It's going to take us all working together to figure that out. And you've made some good suggestions, and it gives me hope that we'll get there at some point.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you guys for allowing me to ask the last question. I had seen you guys in press conference today, and I was speaking with Dr. Larry Brand in regards to how the cyanobacteria actually affects the human body. I know what it does to our waterways, plants, and we're all physically and chemically very similar. We were talking about the gut microbe or the biota in your stomach. And I know that the cyanobacteria, affects the neurotoxins and things like that. How does the toxins that are in the cyanobacteria, and if it's picking up these other minerals and other things that are in the water as their food source, when they disperse, how is that affecting our endocrine system and our adrenal glands, as well as our neurological system? So that would go for the medical. I'm not sure where that goes, but it's something that I know that I see a lot of people are experiencing problems with.
That is a wonderful question, which will take probably about a lifetime for about 2 medical schools of scientists, and we thank you for it.
Well, Dr. Bradley, I will be following you.
So thank you very much for coming this evening. I want to thank our partner John Cassani. I want to thank Dr. Walter Bradley. Dr. Larry Brand, Dr. Paul Cox, Dr. David Davis, our own Holly Rowan, Dr. Howard Simon, Dr. Parisa Taib, Dr. Robert Zarance. And thank you all for coming out tonight. We are really, really grateful.